Let me say a few words. Having welcomed you, let me say a few words about the program and about our future programs. First of all, I don't want to miss thanking our co-sponsor tonight, which is the New Topics, New College series, sponsored by New College Foundation. And the associate director from New College Foundation is with us. Where's Jessica? I know she's here. Oh, right here. You want to stand up, Jessica? They are, thank you. They have their lecture series, which I'm sure you've seen advertised in the local papers, et cetera. And they wanted to co-sponsor. We wanted them to co-sponsor one of our lectures, and tonight was a good one for them. So we really welcome that. They're also co-sponsoring the reception. I'll say a few words about that because it's slightly tricky. The wine, cheese, and other beverage reception will be at the New College Foundation. I think you may have gotten maps when you came in. There's some on the desk on the way out. So that's immediately following us at the New College Foundation, right across the street, about 100 yards on your right on campus. It's probably useful to mention our program. Of course, tonight's program, we have Frank Pearl, the former Minister of Sustainable Development, Environment and Sustainable Development, and now a lead negotiator with the ELN. It's one of the rebel factions in Colombia, and he's been involved in the negotiations with the FARC, which is another major resistance or rebel movement in Colombia. He's going to be speaking about those negotiations tonight, and this is a first-hand account. He literally was, I think, in Havana, perhaps even just this week, which is why we had to cancel the first time, because as you probably are aware, such negotiations, while best laid plans are out there, break down, reschedule, on and on and on. Having been involved in such things myself in different places in the world, I know that it's not totally within his power to say, I'll be here tomorrow and to make it tomorrow, because something could happen related to his responsibilities. He's an advisor to President Santos. Just as some background, I first met him several years ago when I was doing some work in Colombia, and the Colombian government and the World Bank and the United Nations sponsored the first international Congress on disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of armed combatants, meaning mostly resistance fighters. And I had the honor, actually, of being the World Bank's representative on that group with the Colombian government. And Frank was the counterpart at that time. As I said, he's a close confidant of the president's. Just to get him here, frankly, is a really kind of almost a miracle. He's very, very committed. He's just arrived, according to my wife, who just gave me a thumbs up. And she doesn't do that unless she's certain, trust me. He wanted to change a shirt, and I think we owe him at least that, traveling as far as he did today. Quickly, before he enters, and Johannes Werner will introduce him formally, I wanted to mention our program. In January, we'll continue again with a program on genocide and the American humanitarianism by Susan Harper. That's on January 26th. On February 8th, we have another interesting program, Will Africa Feed China? Let's Think Again by Deborah Bradigan. And then in March 7th, we have Arab Voices. What are they saying, and why does it matter? So he's changing his shirt. I got a 2-minute warning from my assistant coach, Susan Janney, back there. And here's Johannes. Now I know Frank is here because Johannes drove him here, and Johannes just drove. Thanks, Johannes, for that. You made it in one piece. Does he have do you know if he has a computer sleeve, or is he speaking? Does he going to use it? No? Okay. Okay, just himself. That's all we need. So I will, before I introduce Johannes, I'll wait for Frank to actually enter. And as he's changing his shirt, he should be entering anyway. This, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of copies of these, but this is the publication that came out of that first International Congress on DDR, Disarmament, Demobilization, Reintegration, called the Cartagena Contribution to Disarmament, Demobilization in Cartagena, Colombia in June 2009. You can probably get this online. with just Cartagena contribution or Colombia disarmament, demobilization, reintegration of combatants. I hasten to say that's one of my specializations. And if all else failed tonight, I would tell you about my mission in the Philippines last week, in which I basically spent the week with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front talking about laying down their arms and what they would be getting in exchange for doing that, and how to protect them from all kinds of calamities that could come upon them once they laid down their arms. As I was just mentioning to one of my students out there, and for them to lay down their arms after 50 years of fighting the government is no small feat. And for them to lay down their arms when the leader once said to me, "Nat, we are an arms-bearing culture. The Bangsamoro are an arms-bearing culture. We all have arms. We just, we only use them when we have to." And then to go on to show his worldliness and quote what is it, our Fourth Amendment, the right to bear arms, or is it our First Amendment? So he knew what he was talking about. Let's see. Does anyone have anything pressing question on their mind before I get into my Bangsamoro lecture? Take some more time. No. It looks like you're all ready, and I think he's going to walk in those doors. Not like a dramatic entrance, I must say. We didn't plan it this way, but I kind of like it. It adds a little drama to our usual kind of mundane, well-organized events. So we do have these 3 events coming on in the new year, and I do hope you're able to continue to join us. And that'll be it for the season. We also have our Great Decisions program, which Barbara Hicks, our professor of political science here. Barbara, why don't you stand up so they know? I think they all know you. A lot of people know you.
Great Decisions, for all of you who are members, Great Decisions is the program that the Foreign Policy Association runs. We've been doing it for 2 years here. And what you have it, if you sign up for it, you get a booklet for $20 or something like that. And it has 8 different huge pressing issues facing us in foreign policy these days. And we meet about once a week to discuss those. And so do groups all over the country. They fill out surveys, and the surveys responses, which are basically citizen responses to foreign policy issues, are actually reported in the media and reported to the government. So it's a pretty interesting sort of conversation. So there'll be emails out to all members about that program. If you're interested, please respond quickly about the types of days and times you can make, and then we'll set up some groups for those events.
I see them putting a mic on Frank right now, so.
Good.
Hi, Claudia.
I'll go to the restroom for
Good to see you. I will jump off the stage, but then I only have to jump back on. I will properly embrace you when I get down. Thank you. They're in the process. They're creating they're following the Irish Republican model, which is to place them in a third party, what they call a locked box, and 2 parties hold the keys. Right? They hold one set of the keys, and the mediators hold the other set, not the government. We meaning who? The U.S. Well, they have a huge reconstruction project, actually. A huge reintegration, a social and economic reintegration of these fighters. I mean, the whole idea is how do you convert them from warriors to productive citizens? How do you give them skills, land, credit, access to credit? There's a whole program, which...
It is a huge country, and this is called the southern part of the Philippines.
That's correct. It's in Mindanao.
There are an enormous amount of islands there.
Well, yeah, Mindanao itself, though, is the main island, which is virtually a continent, to be honest with you. It could be an independent country. You've been there, so you know. The resource base there is phenomenal. But you're right. Frank, welcome. Please come up here. Johannes is going to introduce you. All right, without further ado, if you have a seat for a moment, Johannes is going to give an introduction. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Johannes, who many of you probably know is one of our board members, and he runs a radio show on the Caribbean and Latin America, and also edits Cuba Standard, In fact, this probably is his last session with us. He's going to be moving back to Germany. Is that correct? Somewhere in Europe? For half a year. So he's not going to be gone forever. In fact, he wanted to resign from the board, but we voted that he should have a leave of absence. He didn't have a vote on this, by the way. Johannes, let me turn over to you, and then you can introduce Frank. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your patience, everyone.
This is what you get
Thank you.
from an organization that decided to get speakers that are in the middle of things. This is literally what's happening. When I picked up Frank Pearl González at the airport, he got a call. It happens to be from his president. And he feared that it was because he took off while he should actually be at the negotiation table this week. There's a very important round of negotiations going on about justice. It's supposed to end on Thursday, but he wanted to be with us here, so Frank Pearl came. Frank has an interesting background for peacemaker. He's an investment banker. He's someone who can put together deals, organize them, set them up. And I asked him, how did you ever get into this peacemaking stint? And he said he always had decided a long time ago that he wanted to retire early from his investment banking stint and work for a nonprofit. This is what he got in 2009, kind of, when the first lady of Colombia, the wife of Alvaro Uribe, set up a social organization which Frank Pearl was in charge of putting together. Long story short, he ended up being the High Commissioner for Peace of Colombia because exactly at that time, tens of thousands of guerrilleros and paramilitary were demobilized, and Frank put together the organization that made that possible. From there, he evolved to being at the negotiation table of the talks between the Colombian government and the FARC rebel organization. This is Colombia's largest rebel organization. These negotiations started 3 years ago in Havana, Cuba, and he's been at the table ever since. This is a major undertaking. The civil war in Colombia has cost more than 200,000 lives. It's displaced millions of Colombians, and this conflict is deeply ingrained in the history and conscience of Colombians. So to settle this is not a small undertaking. Just to make you also understand that it's not just a conflict that affects Colombians. Our taxpayer funds have been going to prop up the military of Colombia to the tune of billions of dollars. So we stand to benefit as well from peace. Please welcome Frank Pearl González.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, Nat, and thank you, Johannes, for the invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here today, sharing with you the efforts that we've been making in the last years to achieve peace in our country. I think that the best way would be for me to make a summary, and then we can open up the door for a conversation. Peace in Colombia, it's a hot topic, but not only because it's something that is happening right now, the process itself, but because all Colombians have suffered, directly or indirectly, the impact of the conflict. So we have strong emotions about it. Some people have fear, others have rage, other ones revenge, other people have hopes. So the emotions determine in a large part the perception that we have about the process and our own opinions on what we should do. So I would start by saying that all opinions are legitimate and all opinions about what we're doing are valid. But for us as negotiators, especially those opinions or the opinions of those that are against what we're doing or that have concerns, because those are the same concerns that we bring to the table when we try to craft a deal that will benefit our country. The main challenge that we have today as a country has not to do with FARC or with ELN. FARC and ELN are only the symptoms of deeper issues that we haven't solved for decades and that we will be able to solve on an easier and better manner if we end the conflict. So let me share with you where the process is, what we have achieved, and what will come next. But talking about challenges, I think that the way our country is divided on this side of the table, meaning the strong political divisions that we see today in the country, divisions between friends, peers, sometimes family members, because of strong opinions about what we should do, is the greatest challenge that we face. Because as a society, we need to be united and have one purpose, even if we don't agree on how to reach that purpose. We should find better and more constructive ways of dialoguing and of achieving different types of solutions at different levels. Every Colombian president in the last 50 years has tried to negotiate with the guerrillas. There has been no exception. In the late 80s, we conducted some successful peace processes at the beginning of the 90s as well. We had a new constitution in 1991 that was indirectly the result of a peace process that was conducted with some of the movements in the early 80s. And Colombia has been the only Latin American country that has maintained its guerrilla groups. But every Latin American country from Mexico to Argentina has had guerrilla groups, because guerrilla groups are in part the result of the Cold War, on parts of the strategy of the former Soviet Union and the Cuban government trying to enforce their system in the continent. But every country, from Mexico to Argentina, found a different solution. Some processes were more complex, like the ones in Nicaragua, El Salvador, or Guatemala, or some guerrilla, or some deals with the guerrilla were simpler, like the one they had in Venezuela. But we were stuck with these guerrilla groups. And now, in the 21st century, we think there's no space and there's no reason for us to be in this struggle that, as Johannes said, has brought more than 220,000 victims, more than 500 million people displaced, and a lot of pain in our country. In early 2009, after having demobilized more than 33,000 former paramilitary members, former President Uribe thought that part of his legacy could be to plant the seeds for a peace process with the guerrilla, knowing that there will be not enough time to conduct the whole process. The process was initiated. And the way the process was thought was a process in 3 phases. A secret phase in which we would negotiate an agenda. And once the agenda was determined, then we will have a public phase to develop that agenda. That is the phase we are right now with FARC. And then after signing a final agreement, then we will have the implementation. In the case of FARC, we began working in the secret phase in, I think it was late January of 2012, and we went to Cuba and stayed in Cuba from late January until August, and we determined with the FARC an agenda that has the following points. The first, rural reform. The second, political participation. The third one, illicit drugs. The fourth, end of the conflict. The fifth, victims and justice. And then implementation. Why did we design the agenda as it is? We understood that we needed an issue on the agenda that would allow FARC commanders to go back to the bases and tell them that it is worth to pursue a political solution. One of our advisors is William Ury, who is an expert in negotiation at Harvard. And I remember him telling the president that we needed a golden bridge. And a golden bridge is something that you provide to your counterpart when you're in a position of strength, that provides dignity so that your counterpart can come and cross that bridge towards where you are. And that's what we want, and that's what we've been doing, because when the process started, we had several conditions that made it for us clear that it was the time to do this. First, the military strength was clear. After 2 governments of former President Uribe, FARC and ELN had clear that they would have no possibility of seizing power by force. Then the diplomatic environment in the continent, the leftist political and social movements were conveying a message to FARC and ELN that their political struggle in combination with arms was undermining the possibilities of the leftist political parties in Colombia. And they were providing less oxygen to these movements, not only in Latin America, but also in Europe. Also, the social and political context of our country is a country that is in need of political and democratic opening, and the economic strength of the economy at that point in time were 4 items that would allow us to sit down with the guerrilla and negotiate in a position of strength. So we chose the rural reform issue because in Colombia there's a tremendous gap between those Colombians that live in cities and those Colombians that live in non-urban areas. For example, the average of poverty levels is like 28% for the country. But if you take non-urban areas, you can find some municipalities in which the poverty levels are 45%. If you go to the areas in which the conflict is more intense, you can find poverty levels above 55 or 60%. And that happens as well with extreme poverty. That happens as well with the level of access to public services like health, education. So there's about 15 million Colombians that have been trapped in the middle of the conflict because we don't have a strong state and we haven't been able to provide market opportunities for those citizens. So if you will, I would say that from a moral point of view, we need to do something about that. I think we have the duty to make all possible efforts so that those Colombians that live under those conditions and that are trapped in the middle of the conflict cease to live under those circumstances and are able to live a normal life. So we started negotiating the rural reform issue, having in mind the objective of eliminating extreme poverty and decreasing significantly poverty in those regions within the next 10 years. And if you read the agreements, I invite you to read the agreements, all of it is public and internet. Those agreements that have to do with the rural development plan are a development plan that should have been done in our country 50 or 60 years ago. It talks about land distribution, infrastructure, health, education, connectivity, always protecting the economic system, always protecting private rights, always not only protecting but making use of market conditions and mechanisms to dynamize the economy and provide better access to citizens to opportunities not only in agriculture and cattle, but in all non-urban activities. Agricultural cattle are only 50% of the non-urban GDP. So the first item of the rural reform has to do with land access and use. Colombia is a large country. We have something like 114 million hectares, but the use of land is not efficient. For example, we have like 5 million hectares in agriculture, and we could have 20. And we have 40 million hectares in cattle, and we should have no more than 5 or 6. We only have 7 million hectares in forestry, and we could have 14. So that non-optimal use of land creates a lot of conflicts. And within that, the Gini distribution of land is very inefficient. So the challenge was, how do you do to protect private property? How do you do to protect the rights of those Colombians that have acquired the land under the law, and at the same time create mechanisms so that that land is over time redistributed, but more than that, prepared for it to be productive. So the first thing that we decided to do is to create a land fund that will be fed mainly through borrowings. In Colombia, we have like 2 to 3 million hectares of borrowings. Borrowings are land that belong to all Colombians that don't have titles and that over time have been acquired illegally by local organizations, criminal or illegal organizations that work in conjunction with the justice system or the notary system. So we decided that those lands needed to be identified, taken away from those that have seized those lands illegally, and to be able to protect the property rights, we also agreed to create a new agricultural jurisdiction. We're recognizing that the justice system that we have today is not strong enough and is not efficient enough to protect the rights of those that have acquired land legally. We will also have subsidies lines and credit lines for those peasants and families of peasants and cooperatives that have the will and the tradition of working the land, and we will have a massive program for formalizing property in the non-urban areas. That's about the access. Now, about the use. A new, it's not an institution, but it will be a group of people that will depend directly from the president, that will define and determine with a long-term view the guidelines for the use of land. Some countries like Mexico have methodologies like the revolution of resources, which allow you to have a map and through different types of mechanisms and methodologies determine what's the best use of that land in a scope that goes 50 or 100 years in time. And with that in conjunction with a cadastre that is going to be updated in the next 10 years will allow us to determine how that land will be used with the criteria of public benefit. And with that, you will determine how land needs to be used. That will bring a tremendous benefit, which is today we have enormous conflicts at local levels, regional levels, and even at the central government's level because of the conflict of interest between those that wants to do mining, others want to do infrastructure, others think that those lands should be preserved, others think that probably you could do commercial building. So those technical criteria are going to be the guidelines for land use. And the cadastre is going to be what's called a multi-purpose cadastre. What we're going to do is to update the premises, the limits, the owners, the values, and the potential land users. Now, that will lead us to formalize those properties, and that is very important for the Colombian municipalities because the Colombian municipalities today only have 4 ways of funding. 2 of them depend on the central government, and the other 2 depend on commercial or real estate activities. But 60% of all properties in those areas are not formalized. So the municipalities don't have access to taxes. What the multiple purpose cadastre would do is to, once the investments reach a region, it will gradually upgrade the value of the properties, and it will make it compulsory for those owners to pay taxes. So if you own a land and that land is productive, over time you will only have 2 options. Either you go and you make that land productive, so after taxes, it benefits you in a similar or better way than other investment options that you have, or you rent or sell that land. And that is a way of dynamizing the land market, protecting private property, but also bringing benefits to those that know how to make better use of that land. The other component of the agreement is the environmental component. This will be the first peace agreement in the world that has an important chapter related to the environment. Because in Colombia, we have special areas that have been invaded and that have been damaged and that are being damaged today by illegal groups in relation to narco-traffic or in relation to criminal mining and other activities that are being developed in those regions. So what we decided is to define those special zones that have importance in terms of their ecosystems so that those areas are protected. But today we have communities that are linked to illegal groups, to the guerrilla groups that live there. So using market mechanisms, communities will be able to take care of those areas. They will be paid just to take care of those areas using mechanisms that we have today in the law but we don't use. and those special environmental zones will be protected by the communities that today live in those areas. Now, the second chapter of the rural reform has to do with special development programs. We will bring infrastructure, we will bring health, we will bring educational programs that have to do with the population that live in each of the regions. What we're talking about here is connectivity. Development is connectivity. Development is connecting one person to another, one family to another, one town to another, one region or department to another. And what we want to do is to connect the non-urban Colombia within itself and the non-urban Colombia with the urban Colombia. So massive investments in infrastructure, not only roads, but connectivity in terms of IT, in terms of technology, will be deployed in those zones to special regional development plans. Now, those regional development plans will be deployed in areas according to 4 criteria. We will choose the poorest areas. We will choose then the areas in which illicit crops have the highest presence. The third criteria has to do with illegal economy being important in those regions and with institutional weakness. What we have to do is to create or strengthen state institutions and then to create market opportunities for the citizens that live on those regions. The plans are going to be designed, implemented, and controlled by the communities in those regions, but the responsibility of its execution is going to be maintained, of course, in regional governments. The second issue of the agenda that we already agreed upon has to do with politics. And this has generated a tremendous debate in Colombia because there's people that think that FARC should demobilize, should give up their arms, and that they should never participate in politics. And that's valid. That's a valid opinion. There's other people that think that it's a political agreement and that the objective of this is to open up politics and that they should be able to participate in politics once they go through the filter of justice. The first item of the political participation issue has to do with democratic opening. Colombia, since 1991, has a task that is pending, and that is we don't have a clear set of rules of engagement between government and opposition parties. We don't have a statute of opposition. And any modern democracy needs rules of engagement between government and opposition. So what you see in Colombia is that the rules for creating political movements and political parties are very tight. If you want to create a different political party, a party that is not in power, it is very tough, it is very difficult. For example, if you lose an election because you don't achieve a threshold, even if you have a political movement, you have to dissolve that movement. So it is not possible for people to create a political movement today, to try and win an election, to lose an election, and to maintain the organization because you lose the legal status. That forces people that want to get into politics to create alliances that are made only to win elections. And those alliances lack political and ideological coherence. So what we find today in our country is that there's no one political party that is coherent with its ideology. What you find is short-term alliances that are made to win election after election, and that in general terms, what they do is they make agreements about programs, budgets, and bureaucracy. That's the reality. And I would say that we have no exception today. Of course, we have very serious people in government, but we don't have the mechanisms to create a coherence, a long-term political coherence in the parties that we see doing politics in Colombia. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a set of rules that will make it easier for political movements and parties to be created, allowing them to stay in the game even if they lose, of course, not having the benefits and the duties of those political parties that win the elections, but being able just to stay in the game, sharing their ideas with citizens. It's going to be a major change. The other item that we agreed has to do with the electoral system. We have an electoral system that has advanced very, very much in the last 15 or 20 years, but a modern electoral system goes much more farther than being able to count the votes in an accurate and fast manner on election day. It has to do with access of all citizens to a free vote without the intervention of interests different than the citizens' will. And we don't have that in some of the regions of the country. Of course, we cannot negotiate that with FARC because it's not legitimate. They are an illegal armed group. So what we agreed upon is that if we reach the end of the conflict, the government will create a committee, and that committee will be composed by one member of each political party, and that committee will present to Congress some recommendations so that we have a project that goes through Congress that will help us modernize the electoral system in the long run. So we will see that the differences that we have today, for example, if you're going to vote in Bogota, you can say that in most cases you can vote freely. But if you are a low-income peasant in a distant region of the country, it is very feasible that your vote would likely be influenced by political or economic interests different from your will. This has to do with political culture, and this has to do with civility. So in the long run, this has to be complemented with educational programs in those regions in which the participation in election is lower, and in those regions in which we have seen more influence, non-desirable influence of the will of voters in those areas of the country. The other aspect that we agreed upon has to do with social movements. In Colombia, there's social and civic organizations, and the legislation that we have is probably one of the most moderns that we have in the country, that we have in the world. But sometimes it is abused by the social organizations. So it is difficult for local governments and even for the central government to deal with those social movements, and it is difficult for the private enterprises to be in the middle of the state and those movements. So what we need to create is a system in which citizens can participate, they can express themselves hoping that their opinions will be taken into account for public policy matters, but that has to be done respecting the will of those that at some point in time don't want to participate, and respecting, of course, the results of the elections. Because what we're seeing in the world is like a struggle between direct democracy which is the one that is tried to be imposed by social and civic organizations, not recognizing representative democracy. But we need to strengthen the political parties and the institution so that those expressions, public expressions, are channeled through the institutions so that public policy in fact reflects not only the interest of the majority, but also the interest of minorities in an orderly and peaceful way. One of the aspects of the agreement that has been debated the most has to do with the creation of some transitional peace districts for the Congress. So when we were finalizing the discussion of the political participation topic, we agreed that once the FARC commit to demobilizing and giving up their arms, we will determine some regions of the country in which we will create special transitional districts so that they will have these jurisdictions in which they will compete with other new political parties and political movements for some seats in the chamber. The third issue that we agreed in the middle of last year has to do with the illicit drugs. Colombia, of course, we all know, has been the main cocaine producer for some years. In the last years it was not the case, but this year unfortunately that's the case again. And as a society we have struggled and we have fought against the mafias with a very high cost. We have lost judges, we have lost honest politicians. The role of the private sector has been very difficult because extortion was part of the activities. The media was threatened, and the society as a whole was threatened by criminal organizations. Fortunately, we were brave enough to fight, and we were brave enough to decrease the impact of those organizations. But we cannot say that battle is over. It's a very difficult battle. As long as there's markets, there will be producers. And as much as we have advanced, we need to advance more to a point in which the drug production and the drug trafficking has the lowest impact possible in our country. We don't pretend to say that with this agreement, narco-traffic is not going to exist in Colombia. That would be naive. But the three agreements that we made with FARC will definitely be a very important contribution in advancing in that manner. The first has to do with the substitution of illicit crops. Within the context of the rural reform, what we're going to do is we're going to create conditions so that the peasants that today cultivate cocaine will have other options. I mean, here we need a combination of carrot and stick. We need to recognize that those peasants, or some of those peasants, are not cultivating cocaine because they want to do that no matter what. Some of them might be in that situation, but some others might be in the situation in which they don't have other options because the economy is illegal or there are no alternatives. So we need to create alternatives for them. Within the rural development plans, we're going to create alternatives for those peasants, and then once those alternatives are created, they have the possibility of switching to formality, to legality. If they don't do so within a period of time, then the state maintains the stick. We show the carrot, but we maintain the stick. But through the carrot, we're recognizing that we have a social problem that we need to solve. And the FARC have committed to participate in that transition. It is no secret that people that belong to the FARC today have control over some of those territories and have strong links with those communities. So as part of their commitment to reparation and to justice, they will participate in the transition, making it possible for those peasants to be formal and legalized. In those regions, there's a lot of mines that have been planted by FARC to protect those crops, because that is the essence of their funding. So what they have committed to as well is to a demining program in those regions that will take around 20 years if it's done well, but they're committed to do it, and they're committed to be on the ground doing that with the Colombian army and the help of international agencies. So what we will do is to conduct demining initiatives, and once a territory is clean, then you can proceed to substitute illicit crops with legal crops and invest in infrastructure, in health, and so on and so forth. The second issue related to the illicit drug problem has to do with prevention and public health. We have examined the patrons of consumption, taking into account the geography, the ages, the types of drugs, and a national intervention is going to be implemented, but not from the justice side of it, or not from the, I would say, stick side of it, but it will be something that will be approached as a health problem. A lot of emphasis is going to be done in terms of prevention, education, culture, social investment in communities, families, because the environment in which especially young kids are today has a lot to do with them consuming drugs. So part of the approach that we have today, which is justice and police, has to be complemented with prevention in order for us to make it possible for those kids and young adults that consume drugs to have a better environment and not get addicted. The third issue is probably the most important one in terms of the FARC commitments, that has to do with drug trafficking. The government will review its criminal policy, and the FARC have committed to what is written in the agreement as achieving a final solution to the problem. They have recognized that they have had links to those organizations, that they have funded themselves, and they have funded the insurgent activity with drugs, and they have committed themselves to, quote, end any relationship that might have taken place within this phenomenon. That includes money laundering activities and organizations, and any commitment that they have subscribed has to do with the justice issue, meaning that if they don't comply with those commitments, they will lose the benefit of any justice system that is agreed upon. Since middle of last year, so it's been almost a year and a half, we've been discussing the victims and justice issues. This is a very difficult topic because, again, here, everyone has his or her own opinions. There's people in Colombia that think that those FARC members and FARC commanders should go 20 or 30 or 40 years in jail or 15 years in jail. Other people think that they should go directly to Congress, you know? Yeah, I've been in meetings in which people say, why don't they go directly to Congress? So again, it depends on whom you are, what you've lived, what's your view. But this is one of the toughest questions because it poses moral dilemmas, personal dilemmas, political dilemmas, and dilemmas that have to do with timing. I would say that if there were no future generations, the decision was easier, right? When we were working in creating the agenda with FARC, we defined a point which is called victims, and it's the shortest of the agenda. And we only wrote victims are in the center of the process between FARC and government. Victims' rights and truth. And this issue of justice brings questions like, what is justice? Justice for whom? Justice for what? Some people say justice is what's better for the majority of the population. Others say justice is to give everyone what they deserve. What is the relationship between justice and peace? What is peace? Can you have peace without justice? Can you have justice without peace? What is more unjust? An imperfect solution in a political agreement or a war? You know, those are difficult questions. So, make no mistake, there's no perfect solution. There's no solution that will make everybody happy. And there's no solution that will comply with everybody's expectations. What we have clear is that we want to avoid having more victims. We want to avoid having more victims. So that's another perspective at looking at, because if we look at the victims of the past, then you can define a justice system to make justice for those victims of the past. That is fair. Will that system that will make perfect justice for the victims of the past will make it possible for you not to have victims in the future? Probably not. So we need to find a balance, an imperfect balance between peace and justice. And we have clear that we need to end the conflict, and in order to do that, we need to make a transition. So we're not talking about the justice system that operates on a day-to-day basis in a society in which a citizen commits a crime, and then according to the severity of that crime, he or she will pay a penalty that is proportional to other crimes that are committed and to the act itself. So we've been working with the FARC, and we agreed on some principles. The first principle is that we will, both parties, recognize the victims, that we will recognize responsibilities, that the system needs to satisfy the victims' rights, that the system needs to be designed and work with victims' participation because they have a voice and they have a right to claim the truth, that victims need to be repaired materially, symbolically, that the system has to include guarantees for protection and security to those that are willing and able to tell the truth, that the system needs to include guarantees of non-repetition so that the conflict is not repeated, that the system needs to be designed towards achieving reconciliation. And reconciliation is different from forgiveness. Forgiveness is a personal option. All of us have been through it, in big issues and in small issues. Somebody does something to us, we feel that, that was not fair, and probably we choose not to forgive, or one day we wake up and we say, oh, I forgave this person. But it's personal. And no state can issue a law or a decree so that people forgive. But the responsibility of the state is to create conditions for reconciliation. And reconciliation doesn't mean that we need to be friends. Reconciliation doesn't mean that we need to embrace one another. But it means that we're willing and able to make a pact so that differences will be dealt with respect, without violence, and within the law. That no harm amongst ourselves using violence will be used to settle divisions. So that is part of the transition. And the other principle that we agreed upon is that it's a rights-based approach. We need to recognize the rights of those Colombian citizens that are today in the middle of the conflict. We need to recognize the rights of those that are victims. And we need to recognize the right that those that are not today victims, not to be victims ever. So I guess that very early in the next few days, we will have, or we might have, a final agreement on victims and the justice system. And what will be left of the agenda will be the end of the conflict. There's a group of the military forces, active military forces, that have been working almost for a year on determining the zones in which the FARC will concentrate, how will they demobilize, what will happen with their arms, who will take care of those arms, how can we make sure that the combination of politics and arms is never used in our country again. After that, people will vote, and people will have the right to say yes or no to these agreements. And we'll have the implementation. With the ELN, which is another smaller guerrilla, we're only in the secret phase. We're delayed. It's a challenge for us. And maybe with the next month or the next few months, we will have a public agenda with them. But of course, the issues related to justice, end of the conflict, and the core of what has been agreed upon with FARC will not be repeated. It will be a different process because the ELN is also a different organization. Now, what will come next? And I think this is a challenge that is more difficult and more fascinating than what we've done until today. As tough as the negotiation is, I would say it's the easy part. Because what FARC and ELN show is that we have a country that has been distracted by a non-constructive conflict. Conflict is natural to humans. When you have two or more people, you have conflict because you need to cooperate and you have diversity and you have different interests. So you have conflicts between siblings, between families, between friends, in organizations. We face conflict on a daily basis. But the societies that prosper the most are the societies that find ways to use the conflict as a way of progressing. Societies and organizations in which you find mechanisms to bring out those diverse opinions and interests so that the solutions are built amongst everybody and they're legitimate. And then, through constructive mechanisms, you move on. But in Colombia, the reality is that we have a destructive conflict. And that destructive conflict has prevented us from really facing the challenges that explain partially that conflict. So once we're out of guerrillas, once we don't have guerrillas, what will happen in Colombia? We will have to look at ourselves as individuals and as a society, like when you look to yourself in a mirror. And we will recognize in that mirror the problems that we have not faced because we've been distracted with the conflict. For example, we don't have a justice system that works. Very few people in Colombia believe and have credibility in the justice system. We need to fix that. 60% of our economy, of the jobs in our economy, are informal. That's a trap for poverty. How can you develop a country if 60% of the jobs are informal? So we need a comprehensive reform to formalize the economy. That includes a tax reform, a pension reform, and a labor reform. And that is tough to do, but we need to do it. We need better civil service and we need better civil servants. More than 70% of our citizens today have very low credibility in the institutions. And the best talent of the country is not interested in working on public issues. So we need to redefine citizenship. We need to redefine civility. We need to redefine what is public. And we need to create incentives and mechanisms for the public institutions to be meritocratic, transparent, efficient. That's a huge transformation. That's a huge revolution that will take years. So I would say that once we reach the end of the conflict, we need to have clear that that is not peace. Reaching a peace agreement, as they call it, is not reaching peace. In order for peace to be sustainable, we need to create conditions so that our society is fair, that those that want to do business have clear rules of engagement in the long term and respect for their private property, and that the public resources that are used for the benefit of everybody are used in an efficient and transparent manner, and that we have no excuses. In Colombia, we shouldn't have poor people. There is no way to justify the inequalities that we have in our country. So we need a system that corrects those elements, and that way peace will be sustainable. I would say that that is the summary of what we've reached so far. I would say that if things go well in the next 6 months, we might reach a final agreement, and I will open the floor for your comments and questions. Thank you.
Small group, so it's okay, Frank, we'll just field the questions from up here and identify people, so indicate if you want to talk and take them.
Could you tell us what is the relative strength? What is the relative strength of the FARC and the ELN versus the military forces of the government, and why would they want to negotiate now?
Colombia has like 1,100 municipalities. In 2002, illegal groups, including FARC, ELN, and paramilitary groups, had direct or indirect control of around 400 of those 1,100. 400. Yes, that was 2002. 2010, it was down. If you would, make a deeper analysis, to no more than 68. And today, FARC have presence in 125 municipalities, but out of those, they really have a strong presence in 37 out of 1,100. So that's part of the problem that we face, because if you lived in Bogotá or Cali or Medellín or Barranquilla or Bucaramanga, in the capital city, you don't feel the conflict. You don't see it. You're not harmed by the conflict. So a lot of indifference. We have a lot of indifference because those that live in the middle of the country are in very distant regions. ELN is a different organization from FARC. FARC is an army, an illegal army, that has political objectives. ELN is a different type of organization. They define themselves as a social and political organization with some people in arms. So their strategy is to be invisible. So most of the members are not armed. They're clandestine. So it's tougher for the intelligence organizations and for the army to identify them. So they're armed, but most of the work that they do is through organizations in society, universities, churches, public institutions. They have access to public budgets in some of the regions. They work in a very different way. Both of them have clear that there's no way they will be able to seize power through force. The strength of the military forces is clear, and the government has clear that after this peace treaty is signed, we need stronger military and police forces. I mean, we're not discussing the military budget, we're not discussing the military doctrine, because we will face security challenges in the regions, and we need strong and more intelligent and effective forces in those regions.
Thank you very much for your comments. You have indicated that one of the big problems that Colombia has to deal with is the drug trade, and that's the source of the funding for FARC. And it recalls the situation in Afghanistan after the various wars there. Afghanistan was a big source of drugs, and the government of Afghanistan, when it was finally freely elected, chose to try to eliminate Afghanistan as a major drug producer. And they did it in part by substituting other crops and other economic activities for the agricultural community, so that they would have an incentive not to continue to grow drugs. And also they have set up a strong military presence to try to intercept drug shipments to other countries. And they have done a lot, really, to reduce the drug trade. And I don't hear from what you're saying that Colombia is taking that approach. You seem to be saying that FARC has the right to exist, but at the same time, if drugs are their main source of revenue, those two positions seem to be in conflict.
We have fought, each government and all Colombian society, against drug trafficking organizations for decades at a very high cost. And most Colombians, the vast majority of Colombians are against that. And we've done that by risking our lives. So it's important to have clear that although we have a reputation as a country for being the #1 or #2 cocaine producer of the world, we're talking about a minority of Colombians that belong to some mafias in distant regions of the country. The vast majority of Colombians are people that wake up every day and do their best and work, some of them under very difficult circumstances. So what you will find in Colombia is strength and public opinion support again towards any program or policy that will have the objective to weaken those organizations. And that's what we're going to be doing under this agreement. Because we're not giving up the strength of a state. We're using the same mechanisms that we have today. We're strengthening those mechanisms that we have seen that have not worked. Like, for example, some adjustments to the criminal policy. That'll be strengthened. But on top of that, we need to include a social component. Because the reality is that in many cases, those peasants that cultivate cocaine, do so because they don't have options. So we need to create options for them. That is a reality. If I don't know if you've been, probably you've been to those regions in Afghanistan, or if you went to those regions in Colombia where people cultivate cocaine, there's nothing else. No water, no roads, no schools. So it's very tough. And it might be even naive from our society to ask to those people to do something else if they don't have options. So we'll maintain the stick, we'll strengthen the stick, but we will provide a carrot. And the carrot recognizes that there's an underlying social problem that we need to solve, and that is the long-term solution. Justice and force could be used short-term, but the long-term solution is through social investment and bringing the state to those regions so that those citizens have the same opportunities that some of us have.
Maybe a student up there? I particularly like focus on the victims. They have a victims law, which I quite often pull out my computer and share with governments that I'm advising to look at, because I think their victims law, which has two big pillars. One is restitution, what you lost, and the other one can't get restitution, and reparations for what you lost. It's a brilliant law. It's something that major contribution to the world. The other point I want to make before she raises the question is it reversed the process. I mean, I've learned a lot working with Frank and his colleagues in Colombia. Instead of what I mentioned earlier, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, starting with the hard part, disarmament, they've reversed it. Instead of DDR, it's RDD. They start with the economic incentives, social incentives, reintegration, then demobilization, and finally disarmament. So it's a very clever, I think, insightful way of changing things, doing a kind of jujitsu on the process, combined with the victims law. There's a lot to be learned from the Colombian experience, just to those people.
Thank you, and thank you for speaking with us this evening. So in light of the Paris Climate Summit, which has begun today, I wanted to address some climate issues in rural Colombia specifically, and I was looking over your agrarian development policy and what was in this outline here. And I wanted to know, like, where on the priority list sustainable development and also adaptation policy were taken in consideration when you were looking at these agrarian development, and not just during the negotiations, but also during the implementation of this policy.
Okay. When we were negotiating the agreement itself, we didn't include anything related to adaptation to climate change, because that was being worked in parallel of the government. So what we make sure is that we created the mechanisms and the incentives for FARC people and for the communities that are today threatening those special environmental zones to be formalized and to have economic benefits as they're being paid through what is called the ecosystem payment system to protect those zones in the future. That's one thing. Now, in terms of adaptation, we have a problem that is being solved in terms of public policies in Colombia that has to do that the adaptation policy to climate change was more a set of programs that were not being articulated within the regions and from region to region because they were not taking into account the impact of each of the programs in each of the ecosystems. So that's being changed, but that's being done in parallel to the agreement. We really included the environmental issue as part of the agreement because what we wanted to do is really to include that instance that will determine the best use of the land, and that will have not been possible if you were doing it through Congress. No? So we didn't need to include this in the agreement with FARC. But if you went through Congress, because I did it, I used to work in the Ministry of the Environment, and we tried to make those changes, but the economic interest, the political interest will make it impossible. So what we did is we take advantage of the agreement and made some of the changes that politically would have been very tough to do. For example, the creation of the agricultural jurisdiction. That is a big change that is going to change the reality of the regions because those groups that have been taking advantage of the weak justice system would have never allowed us, through the forces in Congress, to approve those things.
Hi, thanks so much for coming to talk to us today. I was kind of wondering about, you mentioned that part of the plan was sort of redistributing illegal land and also offering different jobs for people who were in the illegal trade. But you also mentioned that the justice system in Colombia is not necessarily the best. So I was kind of wondering what sort of protections will there be for people who do decide to jump ship and do legal activities, and for people who reclaim those lands?
Okay. Those people that, I mean, we want to do several things, and there's a part of the question, of your question, that I didn't answer, and that's that we included what we call the closing of the agricultural frontier, which is a task that we've had pending for years. So you close the agricultural frontier, you determine what is forest, what is usable land, for what purposes, and then people cannot move from that, in theory. All right? Now, if you have the peasants and what you do is you identify them, you bring state to them and their families and their communities, and you formalize them. And what we want to avoid is them moving into destroying the agricultural frontier, because for each hectare that you have in cocaine, you have 1.7 hectares of forest that has been destroyed. So we want people to stay where they are, not to move more, because if the displacement phenomenon continues, we will destroy more forests, and we're destroying 130 hectares a year already. So the protection for them would be that once they're formalized through that our agricultural jurisdiction, they cannot sell that land for 7 years, which is the time frame in which the incentives and the state come and make that land productive. So they cannot sell the land, and they cannot rent the land, they have to work the land themselves.
Let's take a couple more questions and then we'll break for the second.
I have two questions. My first question is, I just was wondering why you guys decided to do these negotiations in Havana, and also who is the moderator of these peace talks. So when you're there, like you were a couple hours ago or something like that, who's moderating this? Because you have the government side and the FARC, but who's in the middle mediating these talks?
Okay. About the place itself.
Yes.
In order to solve an internal conflict, you need to count decisively with the support of your neighboring countries. There's no conflict in the world that has been solved without that. And the diplomatic environment was different 3.5 years ago than what we have today, right? Like in our more, close neighborhoods, the situation is more tense. But with Cuba, it's better. We thought that Cuba was a good place because it was not Colombia. It would have been impossible to conduct those negotiations in Colombia. We've learned from that. And we didn't want a neighboring country because it would create tensions and it would contaminate the process with the bilateral relationships and vice versa. So Cuba was a good place because it was a place in which FARC would be safe and feel safe, but we also thought that Cuba had the incentives of being the promoter of the peace process in Colombia in order to reestablish a different type of relation to the US. That happened earlier than we thought it would, but for them to be able to show that they have participated in that process is something that will give them diplomatic stand. Now, nobody more moderates the discussions. We have some guarantors, countries that act as guarantors. They sit on the extremes of the table. They remain silent. They cannot speak unless one of the parties asks them to. Their witness. They receive documents, and sometimes, if they are asked, they facilitate. But the conversations are conducted bilaterally.
Thank you. And my second question was, you mentioned a lot of people trapped in the middle and victims. How do you define who's a victim and who's trapped in the middle? For example, if you are involved in the FARC, are you automatically considered not a victim, or are there, I guess I just wanted more clarification on who is a victim.
A victim is anybody that has suffered the impact of the conflict. For example, if you are a FARC member and you joined FARC when you were 20 years old and you were a combatant, you're not a victim, you're an actor, and you've created victims. You've harmed people, so you've a victimary. But if you are an 11-year-old girl in a distant region of our country, and you're drafted forcefully by FARC, you're a victim. Now, if you stay there for 15 years, probably you're a victimary as well. But that doesn't prevent you from being a victim. So you can be both. It depends on the case. Most of them are just victimaries.
One last question here, I think. Please.
I'm curious, what brought FARC to the negotiating table, and how long did that process take?
I guess they sat at the table because they were politically trapped. You know, most of the guerrilla movements disappeared from Latin America. They are by themselves with the ELN. Whereas 20 or 25 years ago, there were a few of them in several countries. And their political objectives, you know, have somewhat been achieved through another means in countries of the region. So probably they thought that they will never seize power by force, and that a different way of approaching their objective is to go through a political process and then within the democratic system sell their ideas And I think we cannot be naive enough to think that they will change their ideas. This is not about them changing their political objectives. They will have those political objectives. They have the ideology that they have. They represent whom they represent, and we do represent whom we represent, and that hasn't changed. The main thing that we want is that they don't resort to violence in order to do politics. But once they're part of the system, once they go through filters of justice, they will go out, and probably the ideas that they will try and sell to people are basically the same ideas that they've been defending as of today. So I would say it's a practical approach, because otherwise they will disappear. That's one thing. The other thing is that the commanders are at an age in which they're tired. And they know, but because of the strength of the military forces, every year or year and a half, one of the high-level commanders is shot dead. And that's the reality, and they know that. And then in the middle rank commanders, you have a different generation, a generation that is more influenced by the drug trafficking and illegal activities than the political objectives that they had in the early 60s or late 60s. And the level of education that they have is different as well. So if we don't negotiate now, in 5 or 10 years, we'll have nobody to negotiate with. And in terms of their legacy to the organization, they know that.
Well, we got the reception. I want to thank Frank so much for.
Thank you.